Everyone hits a bump in the road. What do you do with it? Be inspired as we explore the ways people experience, navigate, and manage the ups and downs and twists and turns in this road trip called life. Welcome to another episode of Bump in the Road. The basic podcast is always free. We also have a premium subscription called Bump 2 that lets you listen in on extended behind-the-scenes conversations with our guests. Check it out at www.bumpintheroad.us. Debbie Peterson has a fascinating story to tell. It's a story about history, political corruption, and even a suicide. It all comes together in an idyllic California beach town, and it's all true. Her book is The Happiest Corruption: Sleaze, Lies, and Suicide in a California Beach Town. Please welcome Debbie Peterson to Bump in the Road. Debbie, welcome to Bump in the Road. If you would, tell us your story.
I am now in my late 60s, and someone said to me when I was about 21 that I was an entrepreneur, and I had no idea what that meant at the time. But I discovered pretty quickly that I was. And once I graduated from college, I decided that I wanted to work abroad, and I went to Great Britain. I had a degree in communication, and I ended up starting a company that was very similar to my mother's company that I'd helped her launch in California, baking cookies. And they took off. The British have a great sweet tooth. And in the end, I became the young business personality of Scotland. I won an award from the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, and I had an absolutely wonderful time. And because I did that, I learned an awful lot about creating a board. I was young, and I had to have a board of directors. I was young, and I was in a foreign country, and I was a woman as well. And I ended up with 100 employees and a distribution center in London, and one in Scotland, the manufacturing in Scotland where I lived. And I also learned a lot about balance sheets and profit and loss and cash flow. And after about 20 years, I married and had a son, and we moved back to California, where I originally hailed from. And after my son got a little bit older, I was asked if I would get involved in local government. And so I was on my planning commission in my small town for 4 years, and then ran for city council, and then ran for mayor. And it was something that I could really get my arms around, because the city budget was about the same size that my business budget had been. The number of city employees was about the same number of employees I had, and there were about the same number of various outlets around the city as I had in terms of buildings and assets. And so, and I had a degree in public relations, and my little town needed that. They needed that, and they needed redevelopment. And I'd done a lot of work for redevelopment agencies when I'd been in Britain. So I was able to see some things that most people wouldn't necessarily immediately see. And as a council member, I'd been approached by a former mayor telling me that there was corruption at the sewer board, at the sewer plant, and I needed to take care of it. That was one thing, and I sat on about 17 different boards, as most people in local government will do. And of those 17, I saw probably another 4 where if they weren't corrupt, they certainly were wide open to fraud. And at the time, as a city council member, I just thought, well, it's a small town, it's a small county. Maybe that's it. Maybe people just don't have the sophistication to understand what's going on here. But by the time I became mayor, I could see it certainly in one agency that it was rampant. And as things developed, I realized that it was endemic, and it was running through not just the sewer plant, but several other agencies in the whole county as well.
You know, one of the things you write about in your book that I found really interesting is the fact that this particular small town had a history of criminality, if you will.
Yeah, I kept I asked questions. The communications degree was public relations, but it was also journalism. And I always ask questions, and I'm very curious. And I kept wondering, why? Why? How did this happen? This is such a wonderful, idyllic little town, and nobody wanted to believe it. And I didn't want to believe it. I would wake up in the middle of the night saying, no, 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 it can't be true. And then I'd go over the numbers again and again, and it would be, I couldn't deny it. I couldn't avoid it. It was there. And so I started looking, and there was a local historian who'd written about it. And we really have almost a 200-year history of corruption. And so then I started writing for Psychology Today once I wrote the book. And so that's helped me understand a little bit more. But it seems that people have really developed blinders when it becomes a way of life. People don't see it anymore, or it's just the way it's always been, and they don't know that it would be any different anywhere else.
I think I personally have experienced that trait. I moved to a town that had a long history of mining and also gambling. And it never occurred to me that could create a certain atmosphere where I ran into so many people that were just blatantly dishonest. And I've never seen anything like it. And now in retrospect, I look at that and I realize that the history of a place is incredibly important in terms of determining how it functions today.
Yes, that really surprised me how much impact it has. I think when we can look outside ourselves, you can see the English and the Irish and the Scots and how that all plays out over history. And you can see the history of the Turks and the Armenians and the Greeks and how things pass through generations, even, go back to biblical stories of the Jews and their history. But you never stop to think that it actually could happen in your town over centuries and millennia. And if it happens everywhere else, it probably happens at home too.
To what degree do local officials self-select for their own benefit?
Well, I love that question because I don't think I primed you for those questions.
No,
so
not
that's
at all.
great. Much more interesting conversation. You didn't ask me for a list of questions, as I recall, and if you did, I don't remember giving them to you. So. Tell me what the question was again. To what degree?
To what degree do public service people self-select for a type of personality that wants to work the system for their own benefit?
There we go. Yes. That's one that I have had some help with when I've been doing the research for my blog for Psychology Today, because I'm certainly not qualified in psychology to write. So I have to do it all based on research, which has helped me understand. And there really are two kinds of people who run for office. And this is really helpful when we're entering an election time. One type of person is the one who does it because they do it for their benefit. They think they'll get something out of it. Maybe they'll help their career. Maybe they'll get money out of it. And that can go to extremes, or it can be fairly limited. The other one is the one who goes in it for service. And if we look at historically at the Constitution and what our founding fathers wanted, it would be to do it for service. It would be to leave your career for a short period of time or for a period of time, do your community service or serve your country, and then go back to whatever it is you did before you were serving. And those are the people we want to select. Those are the ones with integrity because their goal is service. Whenever someone's goal is self-service, then that's exactly what they'll do. And so when we're selecting people to run for office, it's important to determine who they wish to serve.
I think that's very true. And the other thing we were talking about before we got started was the lack of checks and balances on the local level. And I think that's a really important point that most of us don't think about.
I didn't even know it or think about it until I started writing a course that I have. I have an online course for people who are interested in getting involved in their communities. And I realized that the three branches of government that we're all taught about in school, in civics classes, the administrative or the legislative, the executive, and the judicial, that and we believe that those branches balance one another, and they do at the federal level. And we've seen that in very recent history, that they are balancing one another, that there's accountability because of that. But our Constitution, our federal Constitution, does not cover local government. And cities are literally separate political bodies. They're separate bodies of people who wish to govern themselves. And they do not have the same requirement to have those three separate branches of government. And so if you look at the structure of most cities and often even counties, although they're a little bit better because they're actually branches of the state, which is established by the federal constitution. But cities, you have your legislature, the people who make the laws, and that's your city council, your town council, your board of supervisors, and they make the laws. But then they also choose the executive branch. So they choose the city manager, they choose the chief of police, which means that they control that. And that if the police and the city manager don't do as the city council wishes, they do not keep their jobs. But then you say, well, that's okay. Okay, so those two are all mixed up. You don't have checks and balances there, but you've still got the judicial. But the reality in many cities is that you don't have the judicial either, because they're usually up at the state level or governed at the state level, and often not really paying any attention to what's happening in the cities. So if you don't have open government in the cities, if you don't have transparency, if the cities are not behaving themselves, it's usually ignored unless the citizens demand it. And so the checks and the balances for our local communities, the only checks and balances in place are you and I. It's those of us who are voting and then going along to those very accessible local meetings of public meetings.
How do you find transparency in local government? It seems to me that really the only check and balance that's real are audits.
Yes. Yes. Although it's all there. It's all there. The budgets are there. The minutes of the meetings are there online now. And the meetings are videotaped so you can see and the agendas are there. So you've got an agenda. You can see, did they minute what was on the agenda? Did they minute what actually really happened at the videotape meetings? You can look at the budgets. You can, and what I say to people is use the smell test. And if something doesn't seem right, then dig a little deeper. And if you dig a little deeper and nothing much comes up, or ask for some information. And if what you get is hangs together for you, then you can usually let it go. But if the deeper you dig, the worse it gets, you're going to find that as you keep digging, it's going to keep getting worse. And I think you can say that's almost always the case. I've never yet found it not to be the case. So there will be things that seem suspicious because you simply don't understand it, or because it's simply some weird government thing that goes on that has to be done that way for some crazy reason. And sometimes it's a good reason. Democracy is very frustrating. It takes a lot of meetings and a lot of conversations to get anything done. But the real secret is every day people can use a smell test, and there's so much available now that you can look at and understand and figure it out. And we really need all of us. We especially need all of us because some of us are very good at looking at budgets and looking at cash flow and reading. Some of us are really good at reading people. Some of us are really good at just showing up when you need numbers and, a body in a seat when you need a lot of people there to have influence. Some people are really good at speaking. Some people are really good at rallying everybody. Some people are great at knocking on doors. And so we really, really need all the people in the community to be there, to hold for two reasons: to hold the people that we elect to represent us accountable for what they are supposed to be doing, what they promised to do, what we've asked them to do. But then the other reason is to let them know what it is we want them to do. Because if you think of it, we elect them to represent us, but if we never tell them how we want to be represented, they can't possibly do it, even if they're well-intentioned. How can they represent you if you never speak with them? Or you never let them know what it is really, what it's like on the street where you live, because they're not omnipresent. They can't be on your street all the time. They can't be in your head or in your neighbor's head. You've got to tell them. You've got to go and let them know what you need and how things are working where you are.
The idea that grassroots involvement, I think, is really important. And it's really important today because so many people live in a neighborhood where they flick their garage door, it goes up, they go in, the garage door goes down, and they don't really interact much with their neighbors or their community. And if we don't interact with each other, how do we develop the social cohesion that we need for good government?
Yeah, that is absolutely the very most important thing. The United Nations and the Gallup poll have been doing studies now. They call it the World Happiness Study. They've been doing it since 2006, and they've polled millions of people around the world. And what they're finding is the single most important thing in happiness. And they're asking citizens, are you happy? And the very happiest of citizens, the happiest of countries, are the ones where they have social cohesion, where they trust their neighbors, they trust their institutions, there's low corruption. They also have more women. The happiest countries average 45% women in government. We're at 28 right now here. And we're not doing too badly. We're number 17 out of 200, well over 200. But the happiest countries, it's the social cohesion that is the number one most important thing, and the others play into it. So, yeah, and getting involved in your local community is a great way to do it because you really know what's going on, and it's actually very rewarding. It's a lot of fun. You meet people, you meet like-minded people, you find out what's really happening, what's really going on. And I think for me, although I found a lot of corruption, and not everybody's as corrupt as we are. Some cities are run wonderfully, But what I did find, and I still find, and it's very heartwarming, is that there are so many good people. There are a lot of really, really good people, and you'll meet some of them. And it's really rewarding to work, to get involved in your community, get involved in local government is fascinating. And getting involved doesn't mean you have to run or even speak. We all have different gifts and skills, and it's your gifts and skills that are needed, that should be used.
It's interesting when an election rolls around on a local level or on any level, you get the usual pretty pictures and, the candidate and their spouse. And I stand for all, motherhood and apple pie. Well, maybe not motherhood these days, but apple pie. Everyone can create apple pie and ice cream, But how do you really research a candidate and get below that? Because what happens more and more, particularly in local elections, is there is a rumor mill that gets started, and it's almost always ugly, and it's almost always false. As a matter of fact, if I hear an ugly rumor mill, I presume it's false right off the bat, unless they can prove something, show me something different. It's just really dirty politics. How can you research a candidate and start to really know what's true?
My best advice is if you can find a candidate who doesn't do the dirty tricks, if you can find a candidate who's really willing to talk on issues, who's really willing to tell the truth, who doesn't run nasty ads, go with that person because they are a decent individual. And a lot of times, if you're working with people who are corrupt and nasty, who do you think they're really out for? They're certainly not. I doubt they're going to be out for you. I doubt they're going to be representing you. They're representing themselves. And if they're willing to stoop to that level when they're campaigning, who's to say that they're not going to stoop that way again? And when I campaigned for office, I would say to people, we don't steal signs. We don't tell lies about people. We don't tell lies, period. And if you want to do nasty tricks and say nasty things about other people, it's okay to tell the truth. If it's okay to say, I'm okay with telling the truth, and the truth can be ugly, but you don't make up lies and rumors. And if you want to do that, then go work for the other guy, because we don't do that here. And if you can find someone who operates like that, I would certainly encourage going with them, because it doesn't really matter what corruption is not party specific. It doesn't matter what party someone's in. It doesn't matter whether they're left or right, especially on the local level, because you're really working on local problems and you're working together. And if they're corrupt, regardless of their party or their politics, it will never be a win-win. it will always be a win-lose transaction. And at the local level, at any level, it's always in our best interest if we can work out as far as possible win-win solutions. And so even if you've got someone who's inexperienced, if they're honest and their intent is to serve, you are much more likely to get better solutions for your community. So, and that is, it's interestingly enough, all the studies nowadays too are showing that on the whole, women are less corrupt. And that might be one of the reasons why the countries where there are more women in office end up being happier. Everybody's happier because there's less corruption. And there is a correlation there. So another solution would be to elect more women. Now, it's not to say that there aren't some corrupt ones out there. Of course there are. But on if we're just going statistically, we would all be happier if we elected more women. Not just the women, but all of us in the countries where there are more. The men are happier too.
One of the things you did in your town that I thought was just wonderful was you hired a very well-known, well-credentialed, I want to call him a forensic accountant. I'm not sure if he was really a forensic accountant, but he was capable of really digging into the financials. And as soon as you did that, barriers dropped.
The cockroaches scurried. They really did scurry. We had two attorneys who I'd always had trouble with because they were very secretive and they tried to keep things out of the public eye. And I was always battling with them, and they didn't like me and I didn't like them. And we had a couple of agencies that were corrupt. And I was trying to I asked every lawyer I knew and liked if they knew of a forensic accountant that could come in and audit some of our agencies. And I couldn't hire someone in county because I was afraid that they wouldn't really feel comfortable or be trustworthy. And I just couldn't find anyone out of county, but finally came across Carl Knudsen, who is the guy who brought down the Colombian drug cartels and coordinated the whole transnational investigation that brought them down, with many, many, many government agencies. And he also brought down Oliver North and Noriega on the whole Nicaraguan guns drug trafficking situation. So he is revered by anyone who knows about these sorts of things. And he's probably the top forensic auditor in the United States. And he was, he's retired, but he works on things like this. And I convinced him that he should come to our little county. And he did agree to audit our sanitation district, our sewer district. And then later was some private citizens paid him to audit another waste district, the trash district. They're both trashy. And he found, $500,000 of credit card receipts that were in another mayor's house and were for things like, maybe kitchen renovations, maybe a new roof or some solar panels. Anyway, questionable. And unfortunately, the agency bought a really, really big shredder and shredded everything before the DA could get it. So they were only able to convict the gal who bought the shredder. Well, they haven't convicted her yet. They've charged her. She quit, and the attorney quit, and the executive director quit. Well, they retired. And,
I want people to have a really good sense of the degree of corruption. There was a death involved in all this.
Yes, that was a different situation. There was a cabal that decided that we needed to have cannabis legalized. And I agree, cannabis should be legalized. But unfortunately, the only people that they invited to town were the ones who had felonies. And there was good reason for that, because those were the ones who would work with them and pay kickbacks and bribes. And the FBI raided our county supervisor's our county building, one of the supervisor's offices in his home, and found out that he had been bribed by our cannabis mogul, who really by then owned my town. And I had resigned a couple of years earlier because it had become so bad that I couldn't participate anymore, because there was nothing that I could could do about it anymore. It was too powerful. They had too much money. And I felt like the best thing I could do would be to resign and write the books, which is where you and I started today. And in the end, the supervisor who was taking the bribes committed suicide. So yeah, it was, as I said, it was endemic. It was everywhere, and we're not done fixing it yet. When it gets that embedded, you really need to take it apart and put it back together again. And we haven't really taken it apart and put it back together again. And until people face it, which they haven't yet in my county, you can't fix it. People have to you have to acknowledge it's there before you can ever really fix it.
I guess the question then is, how do you put it back together again? Because it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, the lack of checks and balances. To some degree, do people self-select for these positions? The lack of transparency. I mean, do you just get a new monster that crops up?
Well, you can, because if anytime you fix something, if you don't stay on top of it, you don't necessarily replace it with something better. And so that's where it comes right back to each of us as individuals, realizing that this is our government. It belongs to us. We give it all this money to protect us, to keep us happy, to improve our quality of life, to provide public safety for us. And really, if we want those things to be done well and to be done ethically, and if we want to be well represented even up the line at a higher level, then we have to show up. We have to stand up. We have to speak up. We have to realize that this is a government that was set up to be participative. We have to participate.
Thank you for listening. I hope you'll support this podcast by becoming a Bump 2 subscriber. Buy us a cup of coffee. It's your support that makes this podcast and website possible. I hope you found something in today's podcast that inspires you along your own life's path, because sometimes a bump in the road is actually a portal into a more conscious and meaningful life.